The Korthani admiral stared at his tactical screen and laughed. A brittle, chirping sound that echoed across the bridge. A human, drifting in the void between stars, her body unprotected by even a thin membrane suit. No oxygen mask, no radiation shield, just pale skin and dark hair floating in the black, her eyes open and steady as she tumbled slowly toward his flagship. "Log this moment," he said, mandibles clicking with amusement. "The humans have sent us a corpse as their ambassador." But then she smiled, and the admiral's laughter died in his throat. Captain Elara Voss had been drifting for 11 minutes when the Korthani Dreadnought Claw of Dominion lit her up with targeting lasers. She didn't flinch. The red beams danced across her bare arms, her collarbone, the scar that ran from her left shoulder to her sternum, a souvenir from the mining accident that should have killed her 15 years ago. She flexed her fingers, feeling the vacuum press against her skin like an old friend. The comms crackled in the implant behind her ear. "Voss, you reading me?" It was Lieutenant Chen, broadcasting from the wreckage of the Meridian, the colony transport that had been torn apart by Korthani railgun fire an hour earlier. "They're still scanning you. If they realize you're alive—" "They won't," Elara murmured, her voice traveling through subdermal vibrations instead of air. The Korthani had never encountered a vacuum-adapted human. To them, she was an anomaly, a mistake. "Just keep the survivors quiet and wait for my signal." She had volunteered for the drift the moment the Claw opened fire. The Korthani didn't take prisoners. They catalogued species, tested their limits, and discarded the failures. 300 colonists were hiding in the shattered cargo bay of the Meridian, and the only reason they were still breathing was because the Korthani hadn't bothered to finish the job. They'd moved on to the next target, a supply freighter 2 AU away. But Elara had made eye contact with the admiral through the viewport before the Claw turned. She'd stood at the edge of the breach, her emergency suit half melted from a plasma burst, and peeled it off her shoulders like a second skin. The admiral had tilted his head, confused. Then she'd stepped into the void. Now she was close enough to see the Dreadnought's hull plating, pitted and scarred from 100 battles. The ship was a monster, 2 kilometers long, bristling with weapons arrays and shield emitters. The Korthani had conquered 14 systems in the past decade, and the Claw was their crown jewel. Elara counted 6 active turrets tracking her trajectory, their barrels cold and silent. They thought she was debris. She reached out and touched the hull with her fingertips. The metal was warm, heated by the reactor core deep inside. She pressed her palm flat and felt the vibrations, engines, life support, the rhythmic thrum of a ship alive and confident. She closed her eyes and listened. Her body had changed after the accident. The mining explosion had exposed her to raw helium-3 and a cascade of radiation that should have cooked her from the inside out. Instead, her cells had adapted. Her lungs collapsed and reformed. Her skin thickened. Her blood learned to carry oxygen in ways that made doctors rewrite textbooks. She didn't need air anymore. She needed pressure differentials, thermal flux, the kiss of radiation that most humans fled from. She was a freak, a deathworlder who'd become something more. Elara opened her eyes and smiled. Then she punched through the hull. The impact sent a shockwave rippling across the plating. Her fist, wrapped in skin that could withstand solar wind, tore a fist-sized hole through reinforced durasteel. Atmosphere screamed out in a white plume, freezing instantly into glittering crystals. Inside, alarms shrieked. She grabbed the edges of the breach and pulled, widening it until she could see the corridor beyond. A narrow passage lit by bioluminescent panels. Two Korthani soldiers stumbling backward in shock. They reached for their weapons. She was faster. Elara hauled herself through the breach and landed in a crouch. The Korthani were insectoid, their exoskeletons gleaming under the emergency lights. The nearest one raised a plasma rifle, mandibles chattering in panic. She moved before he could fire, closing the distance in 2 strides and slamming her shoulder into his thorax. The impact cracked his carapace, and he went down hard, ichor pooling beneath him. The second soldier fired. The plasma bolt grazed her ribs, and she hissed. Not from pain, but from the heat. It felt good. She caught his wrist and twisted, snapping the joint with a wet crunch. He shrieked, and she silenced him with a single blow to the head. The corridor was empty now, but she could hear footsteps echoing from deeper in the ship. She touched the wall, feeling the vibrations again. The bridge was 3 decks up, at the heart of the Dreadnought. She had maybe 5 minutes before the crew realized she wasn't a malfunction. Elara started running. She moved through the claw like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the deck plating. The Korthani had designed their ships for efficiency, not beauty. Every corridor was identical, every junction marked with glyphs she couldn't read. But she didn't need a map. She followed the heat, the hum of the reactor, the places where the ship's bones sang the loudest. She passed a storage bay and paused. Inside, rows of cryopods lined the walls, each one filled with a human colonist. They were alive, their faces pale and slack behind frosted glass. The Korthani weren't scavengers. They were collectors. Elara's jaw tightened. She memorized the bay's location and kept moving. At the next junction, she found a maintenance shaft. She pried open the hatch and climbed inside, her fingers finding purchase on the narrow rungs. The shaft was tight, barely wide enough for her shoulders, and she had to twist sideways to avoid scraping her skin. But it led upward, toward the bridge, and that was all that mattered. She climbed for 3 minutes before the shaft opened into a ventilation duct. She crawled through it on her hands and knees, the metal groaning under her weight. Below her, she could see the engineering deck, a cavernous space filled with coolant tanks and power conduits. A dozen Korthani worked at consoles, their mandibles clicking in a language she couldn't understand. Elara kept moving. The duct curved upward, and she followed it until she reached another grate. Through the slats, she could see the bridge, a wide, circular room dominated by a central command platform. The Admiral stood at its center, his carapace polished to a mirror shine. Around him, 6 officers monitored holographic displays, their claws tapping at interfaces with mechanical precision. She waited. The Admiral barked an order, and one of the officers tilted his head toward the viewport. Outside, the wreckage of the Meridian hung in the distance, a broken shell leaking vapor trails. "Scan the debris field again," the Admiral said, his voice translated by Elara's implant. "The human female. Find her body." Elara's smile widened. She punched through the grate and dropped onto the bridge. The officers froze. The Admiral turned, his compound eyes narrowing as he took her in. Naked, except for the blood smeared across her ribs, her hair wild, and her expression calm. He reached for his sidearm, but she was already moving. She crossed the bridge in 3 strides and grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the deck. "You wanted to find me?" she said, her voice quiet and cold. "Here I am." The Admiral's mandibles clacked uselessly as Elara held him aloft, her fingers digging into the soft tissue beneath his carapace. The other officers scattered, some reaching for weapons, others diving behind consoles. She didn't care. Her focus was singular, her grip unyielding. "You killed 300 people today," she said, her voice steady. Children, families, people who were just trying to start over. She squeezed, and the Admiral's eyes bulged. You're going to undo that? One of the officers fired a plasma bolt. It struck her shoulder, and she grunted, the heat searing her skin. But she didn't let go. Instead, she turned her head and locked eyes with the shooter, a younger Korthani, his carapace unmarked by battle scars. He hesitated, his weapon trembling. Don't, she said. I'm not here for you. The officer lowered his weapon. The others followed suit, their mandibles clicking in confusion. Elara returned her attention to the Admiral. His carapace was cracking under the pressure, ichor seeping through the fractures. You're going to release the colonists, she continued, every single one. And then you're going to turn this ship around and leave this system. Forever. The Admiral's voice was a strangled rasp. You cannot command this fleet. Watch me. She threw him across the bridge. He hit the viewport with a sickening crunch, his body crumpling against the reinforced glass. The officers recoiled, their eyes darting between Elara and their fallen leader. She straightened, wiping the ichor from her hands onto her thighs. Your Admiral made a mistake, she said, addressing the room. He thought humans were weak, soft, easy to break. She gestured toward the viewport, where the wreckage of the Meridian floated in the distance. He was wrong. One of the officers stepped forward, a female, her carapace etched with silver glyphs that marked her as a navigator. You are one human, she said, her mandibles clicking nervously. The fleet is 12 ships. You cannot. I don't need to fight your fleet, Elara interrupted. I just need to break this one. She pointed at the Admiral, who was struggling to rise, his legs buckling beneath him. And I need you to tell the others what happened here. The navigator hesitated. Then she nodded. Elara turned to the nearest console and pulled up the ship's schematic. The cryo bay was 2 decks below, near the center of the ship. She memorized the route and glanced back at the officers. You've got 5 minutes to start thawing the colonists. After that, I'm going to start tearing through bulkheads until I find them myself. The navigator's mandibles clicked rapidly. She barked an order, and 2 officers hurried toward the lift. Elara watched them go, her muscles coiled and ready. She didn't trust them, not yet, but she'd planted the seed of fear, and fear was a language every species understood. The Admiral finally managed to stand. His carapace was cracked, ichor dripping from the wounds, but his eyes burned with rage. You will die here, he hissed. The fleet will tear your kind apart. Elara crossed the bridge in 2 strides and grabbed him by the neck again. This time, she didn't hold back. She squeezed until the carapace splintered, until the Admiral's mandibles went slack, until his body hung limp in her grasp. Then she dropped him at the navigator's feet. Your turn, Elara said. The navigator's eyes widened. She took a step back, her claws trembling. I will comply. Good. Elara released her and turned toward the lift. Get the colonists ready. I'll be back in 10 minutes, if they're not awake by then. She let the threat hang in the air. The navigator nodded frantically. Elara stepped into the lift and descended. The cryo bay was cold, the air thick with frost and the smell of antiseptic. Rows of pods lined the walls, each one marked with a number and a name. Elara moved through the bay slowly, her eyes scanning the faces inside. She recognized some of them. A young mother from the Meridian's hydroponics deck, a teenager who'd helped her carry supplies before the attack. They were alive, but their skin was pale, their breaths shallow. She found the control panel and started the thaw sequence. The pods hissed, and the frost began to melt. One by one, the colonists stirred, their eyes fluttering open. The young mother was the first to wake fully. She looked around, confused, and then her gaze landed on Elara. "Captain Voss?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Elara knelt beside her pod and helped her sit up. "I'm getting you out of here," she said. "All of you." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "The others. The Meridian." "They're safe," Elara lied. She didn't know if the survivors in the cargo bay were still alive, but she needed the colonists to stay calm. "We're going home." The woman nodded, clutching Elara's hand. Around them, the other colonists began to wake, their voices rising in a chorus of confusion and relief. Elara stood and addressed the room. "Listen to me. The Korthani are letting us go, but we need to move quickly. Follow me. Stay quiet, and don't stop for anything." She led them out of the cryo bay and into the corridor. The ship's alarms were still blaring, and she could hear footsteps echoing from the decks above. The Korthani crew was regrouping, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they decided to stop cooperating. Elara guided the colonists toward the docking bay, where a row of escape pods waited. She helped the young mother into the first pod, then moved to the next. One by one, she loaded the colonists, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. The teenager from the hydroponics deck hesitated at the entrance to his pod. "What about you?" he asked. "I'll be right behind you," Elara said. She sealed the pod and activated the launch sequence. By the time the last colonist was loaded, the footsteps had grown louder. Elara turned and saw a squad of Korthani soldiers pouring into the docking bay, their weapons raised. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the nearest bulkhead and tore it free, swinging it like a shield as plasma bolts ricocheted off the metal. She charged the soldiers, her body a blur of motion. The first one went down with a crushed thorax, the second with a snapped neck. The others scattered, their confidence crumbling. Elara didn't stop. She moved through them like a storm, her fists and feet breaking chitin and bone. When the last soldier fell, she turned back to the escape pods. They were already launching, their engines flaring as they shot toward the wreckage of the Meridian. She watched them go, her chest heaving. But her work wasn't done yet. Elara stood in the docking bay, surrounded by the bodies of Korthani soldiers, and felt the ship shudder beneath her feet. The claw of Dominion was starting to turn, its massive engines roaring to life. She touched the deck plating and felt the vibrations shift. They were preparing to jump to FTL. If they left now, the colonists would be stranded, and the Korthani fleet would regroup. She couldn't let that happen. Elara sprinted toward the engine room, her bare feet slapping against the cold metal. The corridors were empty now, the crew either dead or hiding. She passed through a mess hall, tables overturned, and food scattered across the floor. A lone Korthani soldier cowered in the corner, his weapon abandoned. She ignored him. The engine room was a cathedral of machinery, towering coolant tanks, power conduits as thick as her torso, and at the center, the reactor core itself, a sphere of contained plasma that glowed like a miniature sun. Elara stopped at the entrance and stared. The heat was overwhelming, even for her. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her skin prickled with the familiar burn of radiation. She stepped inside. The reactor's hum filled her ears, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through her bones. She approached the control console and pulled up the diagnostic interface. The ship's systems were protected by layers of encryption, but she didn't need to hack them. She just needed to break them. Elara ripped the console free from its mounting and tore open the housing. Inside, a tangle of wires and circuit boards glowed with faint bioluminescence. She grabbed a handful of wires and pulled, severing the connections. Sparks flew, and the reactor's hum faltered. Alarms blared. Emergency lights flickered on, bathing the engine room in red. Elara kept working, her hands moving with brutal efficiency. She tore through the control systems, ripping out circuits and smashing relays. The reactor's containment field began to destabilize, the plasma roiling and expanding. A voice crackled over the ship's intercom. It was the navigator. "Human, stop! You will destroy us all!" Elara didn't stop. She grabbed the primary coolant line and twisted, snapping the reinforced tubing. Superheated coolant sprayed across the room, hissing as it vaporized on contact with the air. She stepped back, shielding her face with her arm, and watched as the reactor began to overheat. The navigator's voice grew frantic. "Please, we will leave. We will not return." Elara turned toward the intercom speaker. "Too late," she said. "You made your choice when you fired on the Meridian." She turned and ran. The engine room erupted behind her. The reactor's containment field, collapsing in a cascade of plasma and light. The explosion tore through the deck, ripping bulkheads apart and sending shock waves rippling through the ship. Elara was thrown forward, her body slamming into the corridor wall. She rolled to her feet and kept running. The Claw was dying. Fires raged through the lower decks, and the artificial gravity flickered on and off. Elara navigated by instinct, following the vibrations in the hull toward the nearest escape route. She passed through a cargo bay, where crates had been torn loose and scattered across the floor. A Korthani engineer lay pinned beneath a fallen beam, his mandibles clicking weakly. She stopped. The engineer's eyes met hers, wet-eyed and pleading. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the beam. Then she grabbed it and lifted, freeing him. The engineer scrambled away, his legs trembling. "Go," Elara said. He didn't need to be told twice. Elara reached the secondary docking bay, just as the Claw's hull began to buckle. The bay was in chaos, Korthani crew members scrambling for escape pods, shouting over each other in their clicking, chittering language. She shoved her way through the crowd, ignoring the claws that grabbed at her, the mandibles that snapped in panic. She found an empty pod and climbed inside. The hatch sealed with a hiss, and she slammed her fist against the launch button. The pod shot out of the bay, tumbling into the void. Behind her, the Claw of Dominion tore itself apart. The reactor core went critical, and the explosion lit up the black like a second sun. Debris scattered in all directions, glowing chunks of metal and frozen atmosphere spinning through the vacuum. Elara watched through the pod's viewport, her chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The Korthani fleet was still out there, 11 ships, watching from a safe distance. She could see their running lights, distant and cold. They didn't move. They didn't fire. They just watched as their flagship burned. Elara's implant crackled. "Voss, this is Chen. Do you copy?" She closed her eyes. "I copy. We picked up the escape pods, all colonists accounted for. What's your status?" "I'm clear," she said, headed back to the Meridian. There was a pause. Then Chen's voice, quieter now. "Voss, what the hell did you do?" Elara opened her eyes and stared at the wreckage of the Claw. "What I had to." The pod's autopilot guided her back toward the Meridian, its engines firing in short, precise bursts. She let herself relax, her muscles uncoiling for the first time in hours. Her skin was scorched and bruised, her ribs ached where the plasma bolt had grazed her, but she was alive. And so were the colonists. As the pod drifted closer to the Meridian, she saw the survivors gathered in the cargo bay, their faces pressed against the viewport. They waved when they saw her, their voices a distant, joyful noise over the comms. Elara waved back, a faint smile tugging at her lips. But the smile faded when she looked past them, toward the Korthani fleet. The ships were turning, their engines flaring as they prepared to jump. They were leaving. But not because they were afraid. Because they'd learned. The Korthani had catalogued humanity as a weak species, easy to exploit. Now they knew better. And Elara knew they'd be back someday, with new tactics and harder questions. But for now, the colonists were safe. And that was enough. The Meridian's cargo bay smelled like fear and relief. Sweat, recycled air, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Elara docked her pod manually, the clamps hissing as they locked into place. The hatch opened, and she stepped out into a wall of noise. The colonists surrounded her, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of gratitude and disbelief. "Captain Voss, you saved us. How did you—" She raised a hand, and the crowd quieted. "We're not safe yet," she said. Her voice was hoarse, her throat raw from the vacuum. "The Korthani are gone, but this ship is barely holding together. We need to patch the hull and get life support back online before we run out of air." Lieutenant Chen pushed through the crowd, his face pale and streaked with ash. "Already on it," he said. "I've got a team sealing the breaches. But Voss—" He glanced at her bare arms, the burns and bruises that covered her skin. "You need medical attention." "Later," Elara said. She looked past him toward the viewport. The wreckage of the Claw of Dominion hung in the distance, a glowing scar against the black. "How many did we lose?" Chen's jaw tightened. 43. Most in the initial attack. The rest. He trailed off, his eyes distant. "They didn't make it to the cargo bay." Elara nodded. She'd known the number would be high, but hearing it still felt like a punch to the gut. 43 people. Engineers, farmers, teachers, people who'd left Earth to build something new, only to be cut down by a species that saw them as nothing more than specimens. She turned to the young mother from the cryo bay. The woman was holding her daughter now, a toddler with wide, dark eyes. The child stared at Elara, her thumb in her mouth. "Thank you," the mother said softly, "for getting us out." Elara crouched down to the child's level. "What's your name?" she asked. The toddler pulled her thumb out of her mouth. "Mira," she whispered. "Hi, Mira." Elara smiled, and the child smiled back. "You're very brave." The mother's eyes glistened with tears. "We all are, thanks to you." Elara stood and placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. "We did it together," she said. "Don't forget that." She left the cargo bay and made her way to the bridge, or what was left of it. The control consoles were shattered, their screens dark. Sparks flew from a severed power line, and the air was thick with smoke. Chen followed her, his boots crunching on broken glass. "We can't jump to FTL," he said. "The drive's fried. We're stuck on sublight engines until we reach the nearest relay station." "How far?" 2 weeks, if we're lucky. 3 if we hit debris fields." Elara nodded. 2 weeks in a crippled ship, with limited supplies and no guarantee that the Korthani wouldn't come back. But they'd survived worse. She pulled up a damage report on one of the intact consoles and scrolled through the list. Hull breaches in sections 4 and 7. Life support, at 60% capacity. Water recycling offline. "We'll make it," she said. "We have to." Chen hesitated. "Voss, what you did out there, walking the hull, boarding the claw." He shook his head. "I've never seen anything like it." "Neither had they," Elara said. She didn't elaborate. The truth was, she wasn't sure what she'd become. The mining accident had changed her on a cellular level, turned her into something that straddled the line between human and something else. She could survive in the vacuum, endure radiation that would kill anyone else, but she was still flesh and blood, still mortal, still afraid. Chen studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "You're a goddamn hero, Captain." Elara didn't respond. She turned back to the console and started running diagnostics. Over the next 2 weeks, the Meridian limped through the void. The crew worked around the clock, patching hull breaches with scavenged materials and rerouting power to critical systems. Elara threw herself into the work, welding seams and rewiring circuits alongside the engineers. Her hands were blistered and scarred, but she didn't stop. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the 43 faces she'd failed to save. The colonists adapted. They rationed food, shared sleeping quarters, and turned the cargo bay into a makeshift community center. The young mother, whose name was Amara, organized a rotation schedule for childcare. The teenager from the hydroponics deck, whose name was Jonah, started growing a small garden in one of the empty storage lockers. It wasn't much, just a few tomato plants and a patch of lettuce, but it gave people hope. Elara visited the garden on the 10th day. Jonah was kneeling beside the plants, adjusting the grow lights with careful precision. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting up. "Captain, look at this!" He gestured to a tomato plant, where a single green fruit had started to form. "It's actually working." Elara knelt beside him and touched the plant's leaves, feeling the delicate texture. "You did good, Jonah." He grinned. "We all did. You showed us how." Elara didn't know how to respond to that. She'd spent so long thinking of herself as a freak, something broken and remade, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as anything else. She stood and patted Jonah on the shoulder. "Keep it up. We're going to need all the food we can grow." On the 14th day, they reached the relay station. It was a small outpost, little more than a cluster of modules orbiting a dead moon. But it had fuel, supplies, and a functioning communications array. Chen hailed the station, and within minutes, a response came through. "Meridian, this is Relay Station Echo 7. We're reading your distress beacon. What's your status?" Chen glanced at Elara. She nodded, and he activated the comms. "Echo 7, this is Lieutenant Chen of the Meridian. We were attacked by a Korthani fleet 2 weeks ago. 43 dead. Ship crippled. We need immediate assistance." There was a pause. Then the voice came back, sharper now. "Korthani? Are you certain?" "Affirmative," Chen said. "And they're not the only ones out here. There were 12 ships in the fleet. We destroyed one, but the others retreated." Another pause. Then, "Stand by, Meridian. We're dispatching a rescue team." The colonists erupted in cheers when Chen relayed the news. Elara allowed herself a small smile. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd survived. But as she stood on the bridge staring out at the relay station, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Korthani had catalogued humanity as weak, and she'd proven them wrong. But species like the Korthani didn't forget. They adapted, they learned, and sooner or later, they'd come back. When they did, Elara would be ready. Amara found her in the cargo bay that night, after the rescue team had docked and begun transferring supplies. The woman approached slowly, her daughter asleep in her arms. "Captain Voss," she said quietly, "can I ask you something?" Elara turned. "Of course." Amara hesitated. "What you did out there, walking into the void, boarding their ship, you risked everything for us. What?" Elara looked at Mira, her small face peaceful in sleep. "Because someone had to," she said. "And because you deserved a chance." Amara's eyes filled with tears. She stepped forward and hugged Elara, careful not to wake her daughter. "Thank you," she whispered. Elara hugged her back, feeling the weight of the past 2 weeks settle on her shoulders. "We're not done yet," she said. "But we're going to make it. All of us." Later, as the Meridian prepared to transfer to a larger rescue vessel, Elara stood at the viewport and watched the stars. Somewhere out there, the Korthani fleet was regrouping. Somewhere, they were learning. But so was humanity. And when they met again, it wouldn't be a one-sided fight. Elara touched the glass, her reflection staring back at her, scarred, tired, but unbroken. She smiled. Let them come. 6 months later, Elara stood in the observation deck of the new colony on Kepler 442b, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. The settlement was small, just a cluster of prefab domes and hydroponic farms, but it was growing. The survivors of the Meridian had rebuilt, and more colonists had arrived in the weeks since. Amara's daughter, Mira, ran past her, chasing a butterfly-like creature that flitted through the air on translucent wings. The child laughed, her voice bright and clear. Amara followed, smiling. Jonah's garden had expanded into a full-scale farm. The tomatoes were thriving, and he'd started experimenting with wheat and potatoes. He waved when he saw Elara, his grin as wide as ever. Chen approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Elara. "You look tired, Captain." "I am tired," Elara admitted. She took a sip of the coffee and sighed. "But it's a good kind of tired." Chen nodded. "The Fleet Command wants to debrief you. They're calling you a hero." Elara laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who got lucky." "Lucky?" Chen raised an eyebrow. "You boarded a Korthani Dreadnought with your bare hands and lived to tell the tale. That's not luck, Voss. That's something else." Elara didn't respond. She stared out at the horizon, where the colony's lights twinkled in the growing dusk. She'd spent so long thinking of herself as broken, but maybe Chen was right. Maybe she wasn't broken at all. Maybe she was just different. And maybe that was enough. She raised her cup. "To survival," she said. Chen clinked his cup against hers. "To survival." As the stars began to appear overhead, Elara thought about the Korthani fleet, somewhere out in the black. They'd be back someday, but when they came, they'd find a humanity that was stronger, smarter, and ready to fight. And they'd find her.